Greed has a particular smell, you know. It's not the musty scent of old money in a vault or the sharp tang of a freshly printed bill. It's the cloying, sweet odour of lilies in a funeral parlour, mixed with the metallic tang of an unsheathed blade. It's the smell of anticipation for a death that has already occurred. I sat on a hard, unforgiving chair against the wall, a forgotten relic in a room full of vultures, and breathed it all in. That smell was the only thing my sons, my own flesh and blood, had given me that day. My name is Evelyn Reed. At 72, my hands bear the roadmap of a life lived through sheer force of will, knuckles a little swollen, veins like rivers on a parchment map. These are the hands that changed my sons' diapers, steadied their first steps, and signed the checks for their Ivy League educations. They are also the hands that built an empire from a desk in a dusty garage. Today, it seemed, they were only good for clutching the cool leather of a folder on my lap. A folder that contained the truth. The room was the main conference chamber of Abernathy, Klein and Finch, a law firm so old and respected that the mahogany on the walls seemed to have absorbed generations of secrets. At the head of the impossibly long table sat Mr. Abernathy himself, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of solemn propriety. To his right sat my late husband's brother, Gregory, his face a mask of sorrow so theatrical it was almost comical. And there, in the centre, were my boys. Robert, my eldest, was 45, a perfect specimen of corporate ambition. His suit was tailored to within an inch of its life, his hair was perfectly coiffed, and his expression was one of barely concealed impatience. Beside him, his wife Clarissa sat like a porcelain doll, her grief as manufactured as the pearls around her neck. She'd occasionally dab a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. A performance for an audience of one, herself. David, my younger son, was 41. He was the artist, the sensitive soul, or so he'd always claimed. Today he just looked weak, his shoulders slumped, refusing to meet my gaze. His wife, Brenda, a mousy woman who had always been terrified of me, fidgeted with the strap of her handbag. When I had arrived 10 minutes earlier, I'd moved toward the empty chair beside David, the one designated for the widow. Robert had stood up, not out of courtesy, but to become a barrier. He put a firm hand on the back of the chair. "Mother," he'd said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Perhaps you should wait by the wall. We're not sure of your position in the proceedings." Clarissa had chimed in with venomous sweetness. "Yes, Evelyn. It's just for the family mentioned in the will, to save any awkwardness." The two of them, my son and his wife, blocked my seat at the reading of my own husband's will. They had relegated me to the sidelines, a spectator at the carving up of a life I had built. I didn't argue. I simply gave a slow, deliberate nod and walked to the wall, my spine as straight as the steel girders I'd once ordered for our first factory. I sat down, placed my worn leather folder on my knees, and waited. The curious thing wasn't their cruelty. I had seen its tendrils growing for years, nurtured by their father's indulgence and their uncle's poison. The curious thing was their confidence. They truly believed they had won. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the funereal silence. "We are gathered here today to execute the last will and testament of Arthur Philip Reed. Arthur was a good man, a friend, and he will be dearly missed." A round of performative murmurs. I remained silent. I had mourned Arthur already, in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, grieving not for the man he became in his final, fog-filled years, but for the charming, dreamy boy I had married half a century ago. "Let us proceed," Abernathy said, unfolding the document with a rustle of heavy paper. "I, Arthur Philip Reed, being of sound mind and body. I almost snorted. Sound mind. In his last 2 years, Arthur's mind was a house with the windows left open in a storm. Memories flew out. Logic was soaked and warped, and anyone could walk in and rearrange the furniture. And someone certainly had. The will was a masterpiece of methodical cruelty. It began with sentimental bequests, his collection of first edition poetry books to David, his vintage Rolex to Robert, his sailboat, the Gentle Dreamer, to his dear brother, Gregory. I watched their faces. David tried to look moved, but I saw the flicker of disappointment. Books didn't pay the mortgage on his trendy city loft. Robert preened, already imagining the watch on his wrist, a new trophy to flash at the country club. Gregory gave a sad little smile, as if accepting a burden rather than a 60-foot yacht. Then Abernathy got to the meat of it. The estate, the houses, the stock portfolio, the art collection. It was all to be placed into a trust. "The Reed Family Trust," Abernathy read, "will be administered for the sole benefit of my 2 beloved sons, Robert Arthur Reed and David Michael Reed." Clarissa's mask slipped. A triumphant smirk flickered across her lips before being replaced by practiced solemnity. Robert sat up even straighter, if that were possible. "The assets of the trust," Abernathy continued, his voice droning on, "include my 100% shareholding in Reed and Company and all its subsidiaries." A gasp escaped my lips. It was involuntary, a tiny betrayal of the icy calm I had fought so hard to maintain. My company. The company I had started with a $2,000 loan from my father and a blueprint I drew myself on my kitchen table. Arthur, my sweet, impractical Arthur, had been my first employee. I had named it Reed and Company to give him a sense of partnership, a sense of pride. A mistake, I now saw, of epic proportions. The will went on. The trust would be managed by an executor. And that executor, the man who would hold the reins to my life's work, was not my son's. I appoint my trusted and loyal brother, Gregory Reed, as the sole executor and trustee, with full and discretionary power over all assets, until such time as my sons reach the age of 50. The puzzle pieces slammed into place. The late-night visits from Gregory to the nursing home. The sudden chill from the nurses who used to be so friendly. The new private doctor who restricted my visitation hours, citing Arthur's need for quiet. Gregory, the failed stockbroker, the man who always lived in his brother's shadow, a shadow cast not by Arthur but by me, had orchestrated the perfect coup. He had preyed on a sick man's fears and paranoia, whispering poison into his ear until Arthur believed the woman who had built his world was his enemy. Abernathy was nearing the end. "And finally," he said, adjusting his spectacles and looking down at the last paragraph. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of what might have been pity in his eyes. "To my wife, Evelyn, I leave the sum of $25,000, along with the porcelain thimble collection from our mantelpiece, in the hopes that she finds comfort in her remaining years. I trust that our sons will see to her basic needs, as is their duty." The room was utterly still. $25,000 and a box of thimbles. A severance package for 52 years of marriage. A tip for building a $100 million corporation. Robert pushed his chair back slightly, a gesture of finality. He looked at me, his eyes cold and flat. It was the moment he had been waiting for. "As you can hear, Mother," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy, "you're not mentioned here, not in any meaningful way. The will is clear. It's over." David, to his credit, looked pale and sick. He wouldn't meet my eyes, staring intently at a knot in the mahogany table as if it held the secrets to the universe. I didn't look at Robert. I didn't look at David. I looked at Mr. Abernathy. I let the silence stretch, letting their victory hang in the air until it became stale and heavy. Then I leaned forward. The sound of my leather folder unsnapping echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice even and clear, "what is the date on this will?" He blinked, taken aback. It is dated May 12th of this year. It was signed at the Pine Grove Elder Care Facility." "And the witnesses?" "Dr. Alistair Finch and a nurse, a Miss Patricia Gable." "Dr. Finch," I stated, not as a question. "The private physician Gregory hired in April, and Miss Gable, the nurse Gregory also brought in to replace Arthur's long-term caregiver. Is that correct?" Gregory shifted in his seat. "Evelyn, this is hardly the time. We're mourning." "I'm not mourning, Gregory. I am clarifying," I snapped, my gaze finally locking onto his. He flinched. I turned back to Abernathy and slid the first document out of my folder. It was thick, bound in blue cardstock. I pushed it across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of him. "This," I said, "is the prenuptial agreement Arthur and I signed in 1973. It was drafted by your firm's founding partner, Mr. Abernathy Sr. I'm sure you'll find the signature authentic. It stipulates quite clearly that all pre-existing assets and any business assets created solely by one partner during the marriage remain the sole and separate property of that partner." Abernathy picked it up, his professional curiosity overriding his discomfort. Robert scoffed. "A prenup? What does that matter? The company was a joint effort. Dad was the heart of Reed and Company." "Your father," I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm, "was a wonderful man, a brilliant artist, and a terrible businessman. He was my husband, and I loved him. But he was not my business partner." I slid a second document from my folder. This one was old, the paper yellowed at the edges. These are the original articles of incorporation for Evelyn's Industrial Design, filed in 1978. As you can see, there is only one name on this document, Evelyn Marks, my maiden name. I let that sink in before producing the third. And this is the official business registration amendment from 1980, changing the name to Reed & Co., a marketing decision I made. The ownership structure, as you can see on page 2, remains unchanged. 100% equity holder Evelyn Reed. Clarissa made a small, strangled noise. Robert's face had gone from smug to confused. "I don't understand," David mumbled, finally looking up. Dad always said he built it for us." "Your father believed the stories he told himself," I said a little more gently. "He was the face of the company, the chairman, the name on the letterhead. It gave him purpose, and I was happy for him to have it. But he was an employee, David. A very well compensated one, but an employee nonetheless." I slid the fourth document across the table. It was a copy of an employment contract signed by Arthur Reed in 1980. It detailed his salary, his benefits, and his 5% courtesy stock allocation, non-voting shares that reverted to the company upon his death. The room was now vibrating with a new kind of tension. The smell of greed was being overpowered by the acrid scent of panic. Robert shot to his feet. "This is insane. You're lying. Dad would never sign away his own company. You tricked him." "Your father was many things, Robert. But he was not a fool back then," I said sharply. "He knew exactly what he was signing. He had no interest in balance sheets or supply chain logistics. He wanted to paint. This arrangement allowed him to do that, to live a life of comfort and pursue his passions, while I did the work. A life," I added, my eyes sweeping over both my sons, "that allowed you two to want for nothing, ever." "Mr. Abernathy," Gregory blustered, his face slick with sweat. "This is a farce. The will is the final legal word of my brother." "Not when your brother attempts to bequeath property he never owned," I said. It's akin to him leaving you the Brooklyn Bridge in his will. A lovely sentiment, but legally unenforceable. I saved the final document for last. I took it from the folder with a reverence that was almost tender. Arthur's illness was a long and cruel one, I said softly, and this time the emotion in my voice was real. There were good days and bad days, days of fog and moments of perfect, heart-breaking clarity. This was signed on one of those clear days. I placed it before Mr. Abernathy. It was a sworn affidavit dated 10 months ago, long before Gregory had swooped in with his new doctor and nurses. It was signed by Arthur and witnessed by his previous long-term physician, Dr. Evans, and 2 nurses who had cared for him for years. In it, in a shaky but clear hand, Arthur acknowledged that Reed and Company was my sole property. He stated that I had always been the owner and driving force. He affirmed the terms of our prenuptial agreement and his employment status. He ended it with a single, handwritten line. Mr. Abernathy read it aloud, his voice hushed. Evelyn built the world that let me dream. It is all hers. It was always hers. Dead silence. Clarissa looked like she was going to be physically ill. David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what I hoped was shame. Robert stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. And Gregory looked like a cornered rat. I stood up, my knees protesting slightly, but my back ramrod straight. I walked to the head of the table and placed my hands flat upon its polished surface. So let's be clear, I began, my voice ringing with an authority they hadn't heard in years. Arthur's will is a touching, sentimental document that successfully disperses his personal effects and nothing more. The Reed family trust it creates is an empty vessel, as it has no assets to administer. Reed and Company, all of its holdings, its properties, its cash reserves, and its future remain where they have always been, in my hands. I turned my gaze to Robert. You are the head of the acquisitions department. Your behavior today, your utter disrespect and breathtaking avarice has shown me you are unfit for that role. Consider this your official notice. You are terminated. Security will escort you from the building. Your corporate accounts are already frozen. Robert swayed on his feet. You can't do that. I can. I just did. I looked at David. His face was streaked with tears. You stood by and let this happen. You let them poison your father's mind against me and said nothing. You were so desperate for the inheritance you believed I was cheating you out of, that you betrayed the mother who funded your entire life, your education, your studio, every canvas you ever painted on. You are a disappointment of biblical proportions. The financial support you receive from the family company ends today. Perhaps now you'll find out what it truly means to be a starving artist. Brenda let out a small sob. David didn't even seem to hear her. Finally, I turned to Gregory. And you are a ghoul. You preyed on a sick and dying man. You manipulated him, isolated him, and filled his head with lies for your own pathetic gain. I looked at Mr. Abernathy. I have one more folder. This one is for my personal attorney, Miss Carol Albright, who is waiting in the lobby. It contains the sworn testimony of Dr. Evans and 3 nurses regarding Gregory's campaign of undue influence and potential elder abuse. I suspect the district attorney will be very interested to read it. I hope the sailboat was worth it. Gregory's face went the colour of old parchment. He slumped in his chair, a broken man. I collected my documents from the table, my movements precise and unhurried. I slid them back into my leather folder and snapped the latches shut. The sound was so final. I walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the brass handle. I looked back at the wreckage of my family, at the greedy, the weak, and the wicked. You blocked my seat, I said, the words hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. You told me I wasn't mentioned here. You were right. My name wasn't in your father's will. My name is on the deed to the whole damn world you thought you were inheriting. I opened the door and walked out, not looking back. The air in the hallway was clean and cool. For the first time since Arthur's diagnosis, I felt like I could breathe again. The smell of greed was gone, replaced by the scent of something much, much sweeter. Justice. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal action and brutal consequences. Karma, I've found, isn't some mystical force. It's simply the logical conclusion of one's own actions, delivered with the cold, impartial precision of a balance sheet. My attorney, Carol, was magnificent. She descended upon Gregory like a hawk. The DA did indeed press charges. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the testimony of the medical staff he had fired, Gregory crumbled. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, he pleaded guilty to financial elder abuse and fraud. He lost his brokerage license, was forced to pay a massive fine, and received 5 years of probation. The sailboat was seized and sold to help cover his legal fees. The last I heard, he was living in a drab little apartment in a different state. A pariah in the financial community and a disgrace to his family name. He sent me one letter, full of pathetic excuses. I threw it into the fireplace without reading past the first line. Robert's downfall was a far more public spectacle. His termination from Reed and Company was just the beginning. The story of the will reading, of his attempt to disinherit his own mother, leaked to the city's business journals. In the cutthroat world of finance, ruthlessness is often admired, but what Robert had done was seen as pathetic and dishonourable. It reeked of incompetence. No one wanted to hire a man who couldn't even successfully swindle his own mother. He and Clarissa tried to maintain their lifestyle for a few months, but it was impossible. The country club membership was revoked. The lease on his Mercedes was terminated. They had to sell their sprawling mansion at a loss. The strain shattered their already fragile marriage. Clarissa, who had married a wallet and a lifestyle, not a man, couldn't handle the downgrade. She left him, taking whatever she could, in a bitter divorce. About 6 months after the will reading, I was being driven through a less affluent part of the city when I saw him. Robert, my brilliant, ambitious firstborn. He was wearing the orange vest of a courier service, loading boxes into the back of a beaten-up van. He was heavier, his expensive suit replaced by a cheap uniform that strained at the seams. His face was puffy and unshaven. He looked up as my car passed, and for a fleeting second, our eyes met through the tinted glass. I saw no anger in his eyes, just a hollow, vacant emptiness. The look of a man who had gambled everything and lost not just his fortune, but himself. I told my driver to keep going. David's karma was a quieter, more insidious thing. He and Brenda were forced to sell their loft and move into a small 2-bedroom apartment. Without the steady infusion of cash from me, they struggled. Brenda got a job as a receptionist, her first real job in over a decade. David tried to sell his art, but his work, once a passion, was now a desperate necessity. The pressure suffocated his creativity. He tried to contact me several times. He left long, rambling voicemails, filled with tears and apologies. He wrote letters, begging for forgiveness, explaining how Gregory had twisted his perspective, how he had always felt second best to Robert and invisible to me. For a long time I ignored them. The betrayal had cut too deep. He had been my quiet, gentle boy. I thought that even if Robert was a shark, David still had a soul. I was wrong. He had a price, and it turned out to be a portion of an inheritance he wasn't even entitled to. His weakness, I realized, was just as dangerous as Robert's ambition. I restructured Reed and Company from the top down. I promoted a brilliant young woman, Maria Sanchez, who had worked her way up from the factory floor, to be my COO. I established a charitable foundation in Arthur's name, funding arts programs in underprivileged schools, a legacy he would have truly loved. I was working harder than I had in years, and I felt revitalized, reborn from the ashes of my family. I was the matriarch of a company, but no longer of a family. The price of my empire, it seemed, was my own bloodline. One evening, about a year after that fateful day, a package arrived. It wasn't from a courier, but had been left with the doorman of my new penthouse apartment overlooking the city. There was no return address. Inside, there was no letter, no plea for money or forgiveness. There was only a single canvas. It was a charcoal sketch, a portrait of me. But it wasn't the 72-year-old titan of industry. It was me at maybe 25, my hair wild, a smear of grease on my cheek. I was leaning over a drafting table in our first garage, a pencil behind my ear, and I was smiling. A real, unguarded, joyful smile. In the background, barely visible, was a young Arthur, watching me with an expression of pure adoration. It was a memory I hadn't thought of in decades. A moment David could only have known from an old, faded photograph I used to keep on my dresser. He had captured it perfectly. The hope, the love, the beginning of everything. He had captured the woman I was before they had forced me to become the woman I had to be. My hand trembled as I traced the lines of my own smiling face. Hard karma had indeed hit my sons. They had lost their wealth, their status, their futures. But looking at that sketch, I understood David's true punishment. It wasn't poverty or shame. It was memory. It was the crushing, eternal weight of knowing what he had thrown away. He was finally seeing me, not as a bank or an obstacle, but as the mother he once had. And he was seeing it far, far too late. I hung the portrait in my private study, a place no one else ever entered. It served as a constant, silent reminder. A reminder of what I had built, what I had lost, and the terrible, clarifying power of the truth in a simple leather folder. My sons had wanted a legacy. In the end, I was the only one left to write it.